Welcome to AP European History Unit 6. We're getting close to finishing up Unit 6. We've been talking about some of the political developments since Napoleon in France, Belgium, Poland, and other places throughout Europe. Today, we're going to get into Great Britain and Ireland. It'll be a relatively short lecture talking about reform efforts after the Napoleonic Wars and Ireland's sad state during this era. So one of the questions historians have pondered is, how is it that with all of these revolutions going on in Europe, the French Revolution, the revolutions of 1830, which seemed to prompt revolutions everywhere in 1830, and then revolutions again in 1848, which also seemed to prompt revolutions everywhere in 1848, how in the world did England avoid having this type of violent revolution, that they had a stable monarchy? And there's lots of theories about that. So let's kind of go back and look at some of the reasons that might account for England's stability. So going back to the last revolution they had, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which was essentially a bloodless revolution, England had developed a landowning aristocracy. They'd always had a landowning aristocracy, but it was one that was increasingly open to change, open to not only political change, but starting with economic change. That some of them were leaders in the agricultural revolution and leading investors in the industrial revolution, and revolutions that in thought that the Enlightenment makes them realize that government is responsible to the people and must be responsive to the people's needs. The government was stable. You did have a new system where you had political parties that had parliamentary elections, and so governments would rise and fall, but they rise and fell based upon elections between Tories and Whigs. The legal system was relatively fair. There was a by and large legal equality. You didn't have the same thing that you saw in England with three separate legal systems. The legal system was fair by and large to, as much as legal systems are, to poor and wealthy alike. There was some moderate social mobility, that people could move up in the world, that you were not stuck exactly where you were, and some people will use that to better their economic life. Now, social mobility was usually driven economically, not so much in terms of entering the nobility, or certainly not into the royal family. Basic civil rights were guaranteed. I mean, that was part of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, guaranteeing the rights of Parliament, but also guaranteeing the rights of individuals. We will also see the development of a strong parliament since 1688. In fact, the Glorious Revolution was all about the ascendance of parliament and the slow decline of the monarchy. To replace the power of the monarchy, we see the rise of a prime minister coming in with the Hanoverian kings, the Georges, who were a little uninterested in being kings, that they will instead start relying upon the prime minister of parliament to do the dirty daily work of being king. Growing prosperity also helps. We know that oftentimes revolutions are set off by economic turmoil. Bread prices go way up, then you have people out in the streets, especially if that goes along with unemployment at the same time. Yes, they had experienced a revolution, so they didn't fully avoid a revolution. They had a 1776 revolution, which from their perspective was a minor blip. And it was not an attempt to overthrow the English form of government. It was some backwoods colonies who kind of wanted to do their own thing, so good luck to them. And finally, you will see a growing empire that, yes, they lost some 13 colonies in 1776, but their empire continues to grow, and they become the dominant naval force, trade force, as they win various wars against the French and the Dutch and the Spanish, and they become much more interested in their empire, and that empire brings them more prosperity. However, only 8% roughly, depending on who you ask and how you count it, could vote. So you're seeing a system that was politically very fair and representative, but seemed to only reflect 8% of the people. And as more people got prosperous, they wanted more of a say in this government. So starting in the 1780s, there are calls for reforming, especially in terms of suffrage, representation in parliament. But the French Revolution kind of put the brakes to that. Everyone was like, whoa, okay, maybe we don't need any reform because otherwise people's heads start falling off. So instead, there's kind of a long-term halt to reform by the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. But those will pick up after this is over. The two parties, the Tory party, that's generally considered to be the conservative party, the party of the land-owning. Both parties are actually dominated by land-owning aristocrats, but the Tory party, more conservative, more likely to defend the interests of land-owning aristocrats, whereas the Whig party was a little more representative of the values of the bourgeoisie. Yes, the leaders of the Whig party were landowning aristocrats, but they were open to simple reforms, not radical reforms, but reforms that would bring the wealthy middle class more into the government. All right, so all of this is going on. What you have is a system that seems to be open to change, to let more people be involved in the government, more people to experience economic prosperity. Prosperity is increasing. It's almost as though there's not a grave need for revolution. All right, so what happens next? After the Napoleonic Wars, we are going to see some things that start look close to possible revolution, some serious discontent. Some of the discontent starts during the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, the Napoleonic Wars were deeply, deeply disruptive to the English economy. The government had passed what were called anti-combination acts. A combination was any type of labor union, workers group, guilds, and those were outlawed. If you're a labor union, you can't even exist. By the time the war's over in 1815, you will have major economic dislocations and post-war discontent. There were price controls, there were importation controls, and you have all of these veterans returning home, tens of thousands of veterans returning home looking for jobs, and there's no jobs. Even worse, you have crop failures, several years of crop failures, which leads to inflation in the price of goods. So here you have a bunch of unemployed veterans who are hungry. This doesn't look good. In addition, England did not help itself by having what were called corn laws. Now, corn laws, when they talked about corn, they didn't simply just mean corn. They were talking about pretty much any type of grain. Any type of grain was strictly prohibited or restricted from being imported into England. This artificially inflated English farm produce. So if you're a landowning aristocrat, you love these corn laws because it means the wheat or barley that you're growing you're going to be able to sell for a lot of money because there's no competition with other countries like Russia, Russian wheat, or American wheat. So, and again, why is this? To protect the interests of the landed aristocracy so they could inflate their farm products and profits. Well, that doesn't really help all of these veterans returning home. And they have no say in this. Generally, your typical veteran was not a voter. So they did a corn law reform in 1815. And they said, listen, here's what we'll do. If the price of corn gets super high, then we'll allow the importation of some other crops. But the price was set so high, it was unrealistic. To make things worse, in 1816, there was a tax reform that did away with some taxes on wealthy people and brought in new sales taxes and excise taxes that impacted everybody. So protests start breaking out, meetings start happening. You start seeing this percolation of severe discontent driven by this economic anxiety and the feeling that, oh, the government's only about the landowners and protecting their rights. So the Tory government passes the Coercion Acts. You may remember the Coercive Acts back in American history. Coercion means forcing acts. The Tory government basically says, listen, stop the protesting. And by the way, habeas corpus is done. Remember, habeas corpus is your right not to be arrested unless they have evidence. And it eliminates both of those, which naturally leads to more protests. The biggest protest will ultimately be one of the bloodiest days in domestic English history, called Peterloo. So there was going to be a big meeting in Manchester. Manchester was one of those new cities that was really feeling left out of Parliament because of the way parliamentary representation worked. Manchester had almost no members of Parliament. So they were going to have a big protest to demand representation in Parliament and to demand the expansion of the suffrage. one of the radicals, Henry Hutt, was set to speak. They start having this meeting. The local constables come to arrest him. Riots break out. There's some pushing, them shoving. And then the local authorities order in the hussars to charge, basically a cavalry charge, into the midst of this crowd of poor and lower middle class people. You can see some pretty gruesome scenes if you look closely at this contemporary drawing to the right. Around a dozen are killed, again, depending on who you ask. It's not a huge massacre. Sometimes it's called the Peterloo Massacre. It's called Peterloo because it's St. Peter's Field. And remember Waterloo, that's when Napoleon had his downfall. So Peter and Lou, Peterloo. Anyway, so they have this this huge thing. The Tories way overreact to this. And pass a series of what are called the Six Acts, eliminating some basic English civil rights. So it looks like now this post-Napoleonic conservatism has taken hold of England, and the press is completely controlled, mass meetings are banned. It looks as though freedom and liberalism was going to die in England on the fields of Peterloo. But that was not to be. The traditions of civil rights and freedom and responsive government were way too strong in English for this to last very long. So by the 1820s and through the 1830s, we'll start seeing the first big glimmers of hope in reform. The Tories see the wisdom in reform, and the Tories and Whigs start battling each other to out-reform each other. Because they realize, one, if they keep repressing people, they will have revolution, and then all their heads will roll. But they also realize the more reform they do, the more votes they may get. Especially amongst, if you expand the suffrage, those votes may come to you. That oftentimes bourgeois people were very conservative. So the Tories are like, wait, we don't want to change anything. Wait, they'll vote for us? Oh, well, then let's give them the right to vote. So they begin this century-long almost contest between the two about, no, we'll do this reform, we'll do this reform, this reform. And this ultimately is the key for England avoiding revolution, is slow, steady reform, slowly expanding the suffrage over 100 years. And so to the point where the pressure internally, domestically, never builds up to the boiling point, to the explosion point. That pressure builds up, and then they pass another reform. And then it deflates. And then pressure builds up, and then they pass another reform. So in suffrage, in these early reforms, suffrage, that is the right of more people to vote, and parliamentary representation are key. Let's talk about this parliamentary representation for a second. So the way, it's not like it's done, like every 10 years in America, we redistribute representation in everything that we elect to, whether it's Congress or local legislatures or county commissioners, based upon population. So everything's roughly equal. That's not the way the English did it. English are deeply tradition bound. So they had these boroughs that went back 500 years when there had been a battle and the king said, oh, this town, they get the right to elect these two people to parliament. And that had not really changed despite the fact that population had changed immensely. Population had grown, and population grew in places where there was no population. If you remember from the simulation we did of your industrial town, you went from a small little town, which probably had no election, no one in parliament, to a giant industrial city. Well, there was still, your town would have still had no representation in parliament. Manchester elected two people to parliament, while this painting to the right, called Old Salem by John Constable, represents a small English town that had been a mildly important little village hundreds of years before. Old Sarum had 7 voters, and they elected 2 members to parliament. So the hundreds of thousands of people in Manchester elected 2, and the 7 people here elected 2. And generally, they were called rotten boroughs because usually the one landowner, he kind of decided who got to go to parliament. And there wasn't really an election at all. It was just, hey, here's $10. You're going to vote for my guy. I'm sending these 2 people to parliament for me. Massively unfair. So that's going to be a key to it. The first big reform is the Tories do repeal the Anti-Combination Acts. Let labor unions start organizing. Let the working class start organizing. And then the big one, this is the one you do not want to forget. This is the one you put an outline around, the Great Reform Act of 1832. This is what kind of starts this process of continual reform and expansion of suffrage, expansion of rights. It eliminated the rotten boroughs and redistributed parliamentary representation based upon population to make it more fair. Now, it wasn't perfect yet. They couldn't break those old patterns completely, but many more areas are going to get parliamentary that had previously none. It will also expand the suffrage to about 12% of adult males. So that's still a fairly small percentage of the population, but that number is going to continue to grow for the next 100 years until ultimately they get universal manhood suffrage. And then the women are going to say, well, what about us? And they will get it right around World War I. So this is their new model. Change without revolution, by dripping it out instead of having a massive flood of revolution. This is the most boring slide I've created so far, and I apologize for it. We've talked about the Chartists. They're going to pick up from this Great Reform Act and continue moving along. They write the People's Charter. That's why they're called the Chartists, the Chartists. 1838, their goal is universal manhood suffrage, and that's going to be, like I said, the goal for the next 100 years, well, a little less than 100 years, 80 years, until all the men get the right to vote, and then ultimately the women get the right to vote. The Corn Laws will be repealed in 1846. Yes, that hurts the landowning aristocrats, but it was necessary. And then the 10 Hours Act, 1847, we may have mentioned this one as well, limited working hours for women and children. So all of these reforms are starting in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s to make life better for English people. Well, what about Irish people? Ireland was part of the new United Kingdom. Ireland, the island to the west of Greater Britain, had been under England's heel for hundreds of years. Cromwell, you may recall, had utterly crushed the Catholics in the 1600s. If you want to die in Dublin, go into a bar and toast Oliver Cromwell. They still remember him. They will kill you. So there's a long history of the English oppressing and crushing the Irish Catholics. The vast majority of Ireland is Catholic. But Protestants came in and settled there. Scottish Protestants, English Protestants, and they became the ruling class and landowners. So the picture is most of Ireland were poor Catholics, and they worked on land that was owned by English Protestants or Scottish Protestants or sometimes Irish Protestants, a very small number of super wealthy Protestants. So you've got super wealthy Protestants ruling over these very, very poor, probably one of the poorest areas in all of Europe. Comparable, probably in some ways, to serfs in Russia. Well, 1800, the Act of Union, had been one of those things that was supposed to put the kibosh on Irish nationalism by allowing the Irish to elect 100 members of Parliament. But those 100 members of Parliament had to be Protestants. And they had to come from the ruling class. So they were essentially English-Irish. While that is going on, population is growing. From 1725, 3 million, to 1840, a little over 100 years later, to 8 million in population. This population lived in immense poverty. All of the prosperity that was coming to England was not coming to Ireland because the system was so vastly different than it was in England. You didn't have the social mobility because if you're a Catholic and you're poor, you're stuck on someone else's land growing potatoes. So, and we're going to see that this potato crisis that's about to come up will so devastate the Irish population that it still has not recovered. As you can see, the current population of Ireland is just under 5 million people. So in 1840, there were 8 million. Today, there's just under 5 million. And that's because of what happens next. The Irish potato famine. So nationalism was already on the rise before the potato famine occurred. And Parliament had, to some degree, tried to, again, reform that nationalism out of the way by passing the Catholic Emancipation Act that allowed Roman Catholics to actually get elected to Parliament. However, you had to be a super, super wealthy Roman Catholic to get elected to Parliament. And who was doing the voting? By and large, it was wealthy Protestants. Okay, so what happens is the Great Famine. That by this point, Ireland had become predominantly a single crop enterprise. That potatoes grew very well there, and on a single acre of land, you could feed a family of 4 for an entire year if you grew nothing but potatoes. However, if something happens to those potatoes, which is what happens in this famine, is that basically the potatoes rotted in the ground. you had literal widespread starvation, and that starvation led to, if they didn't die of the starvation, they died of the disease that broke out because everyone was so malnourished. So people are slowly starving. Disease breaks out. That spreads very quickly because people are unable to resist it because their bodies are broken down, and they die in mass amounts. The government was terrible. I mean, what do the English care? By this point, the English had always seen the Irish as terrible. They hated the Irish. Government is super slow to help. I mean, why should they? It's estimated 1 million left in this 6-year window from 1844 to 1851. Another 1.5 million died. That's 2.5 million of their population gone. Population declines from about 8 million when this all breaks out to about 4 million right before World War I. And as we said, today it's just under 5 million. So there's not been much recovery since World War I. And this leads to the Irish diaspora all over the world. It'll have a major impact upon American history, but many of the Irish go to England for jobs. They will become domestic servants, factory workers. They will become a big part of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain and the Industrial Revolution here in the United States. But it will also lead to feelings that have still not gone away, that the Irish became more deeply entrenched in nationalism, and nationalism that was kind of married to their Catholicism, and absolute hatred of the British. But during this era, not much will be accomplished, but the spark is born in the Irish that they deserve their own country. They've seen what's happened to Greece and Belgium and what happened to the Polish. So why can't they break away and form their own country? And if you can tell me who this guy here to the right is, then I would be actually quite impressed with you. We'll see you the next time as we talk a little bit about Prussia.